Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking energy supply and critical minerals with Heather Exner-Pirot, who's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Heather, I wanted to sort of turn to talking about critical minerals. I know you've written a paper on this, but I think a lot of our viewers might not even know what critical minerals are and why they're so important. So maybe you could enlighten us. What are critical minerals?
So we all know what minerals are. When we say critical minerals, that's a subjective, evaluation by the Canadian government or the American government and the Australian government. They all have different definitions of what critical is, but essentially it's things that we need, that with the supply is very important, that society can continue as it does without them. And so they're deserving of special consideration or protection or having reserves or securing that supply chain so we can have a consistent supply of them. So in Canada, there's 31 critical, minerals that are designated critical. A lot of them we have in Canada, but we don't process a lot of our own minerals. And so this is where the security supply chain gets very important for critical minerals. With oil and gas, again, the availability of it geologically and across the world is very high. It is a very competitive resource, but certain minerals are very concentrated geologically and geographically. And so you're very dependent, for example, on Congo for graphite. Right now, you're very dependent on China for rare earths, and that's usually the critical mineral that people are aware of, that there's some constraints and that we need to have a better supply. But China is the #1 miner in the world. I think they have about 22%. Russia is the second biggest miner in the world. Combined, they represent about a third of mining in the world. So that's so from a security perspective, that makes you very vulnerable. But on top of just the availability of the mining of the raw material, China has a monopoly on the processing of probably, half a dozen or more minerals, that are kind of dirty or environmentally, sketchy to have to process, requires a lot of chemicals. And so we don't like to do them in the West, but still makes us very reliant on China to get kind of the value added mineral. From copper, even though they don't produce a lot of copper, they do a lot of the processing, rare earths, obviously, all these sorts of things. So making sure that, in the wake of Russia, this realization that, amongst our allies, amongst NATO, amongst the Western world, we better have our own supply chains of these minerals, because it's a lot of leverage to leave to a potential enemy, to have at their disposal to ban or to restrict the use. Without rare earths, we can't have touchscreen TVs. A lot of military equipment is dependent on that. Without, there's probably a half a dozen things that we need to make electric vehicles, to do the windmills, to do the solar panels. It takes it's magnets, and it's even steel, even iron, So we've had this wonderful 20-30 year period of globalization where just the competitiveness of the cost competitiveness was the foremost kind of consideration. China seemed to be very pragmatic, was a good supplier of these things in a very cheap way. But now we're starting to think that maybe we'll have to accept some higher costs in order to have that security of supply.
Okay, so to clarify, a lot of these critical minerals are things they're rare or they're geographically concentrated, and we need them for certain important things. You mentioned electric vehicles, for example, and so it's critical that we have access to them. What is the landscape like right now in terms of control of some of these critical minerals? You mentioned China. But my understanding is it's not a free market in these minerals, and that China has control, or at least a sort of control over certain choke points in the supply chain. Is that right?
Yeah, it's really the processing, and that's the harder thing. Canada, we have almost all these things in our crust. We do. Those 31 minerals, somewhere in our crust, those exist. It's a matter of, is it economic to extract them? So where, they may be copper is more geographically concentrated in South America. It's just more economic to extract it from there. And China has developed the processing capacity that really doesn't exist in anywhere near the same, we're not in the same stratosphere in terms of processing in the Western world. So we are looking at how do we get into that aspect of the mineral supply chain, to make sure that we can have, from the ore to the battery, that we can control that, or at least be very confident that with our allies we can control that. It would be reckless to have this renewable energy transition without knowing that you can source everything you need in that value chain going forward.
Okay, great thoughts from Heather Exner-Pirot. We're going to take a short break and be right back.